All right, let's go. Number 10, the tomb of Ramesses VI. In August of 1817, Italian explorer Giovanni Battista Belzoni navigated a hired felucca upriver from Luxor and arrived at the entrance to a tomb that Coptic Christian communities had been using as a dwelling for centuries. The walls of the outer chambers were coated in lamp black from their fires. The astronomical diagrams on the ceiling and a complete map of the Egyptian night sky carved in the reign of Ramesses VI, circa 1145 BCE, were barely visible beneath the accumulated soot of domestic life. Belzoni cleared the outer passages and declared the tomb accessible. He was the first modern person to formally document what lay inside. He had no way of knowing what he had released into circulation. KV9 is one of the longest royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. 137 meters of descending corridor cut through solid limestone, terminating in a burial chamber whose ceiling and walls display the Book of the Earth and the Book of Caverns in their complete form. A theological cosmography of the underworld covering every surface. The tomb is large enough that its outer sections were used as shelter by multiple generations before Belzoni arrived. It is wide enough that, in the clearance work of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, entire teams of workers moved through its passages simultaneously. The air inside, according to visitor accounts from Belzoni's time through the 1920s, was consistently described as close, heavy, and faintly sulfurous. Egyptologists attributed this to the geology. The geology was not wrong. It was not, however, the complete account. The accepted explanation held that any atmospheric anomaly in the Valley of the Kings was the product of simple ventilation limitation. Old air, dry rock, nothing more. The tomb was open to tourists in the 1920s and has received an estimated 6 million visitors since then. Workers who cleared its passages during the colonial period, cataloging fallen stonework and organizing debris, spent weeks or months inside with no protective equipment and no ventilation beyond what the limestone's natural porosity allowed. But here is where the settled picture develops a crack. In 2010, physicist Tarek Saber of Ain Shams University in Cairo completed a radon survey of the Valley of the Kings, the first systematic radioactive gas assessment of its royal tombs, measuring decay products in the enclosed air of 7 burial sites. In K59, the burial chamber registered radon concentrations between 6 and 8 times the average atmospheric background level measured in the open valley above. Radon is a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas, a direct decay product of uranium and limestone, which the Theban hills contain in geologically significant quantities. In open air, it disperses before accumulating to dangerous levels. In a sealed space, it does not disperse. It concentrates. A visitor spending 30 minutes in the KV9 burial chamber was receiving a radiation dose equivalent to 3 to 4 chest X-rays. A worker spending a field season inside, returning daily for weeks without ventilation, was receiving a cumulative dose that no one had ever attempted to calculate because the question had never been asked. Radon causes lung cancer. It is the second leading cause of lung cancer in non-smokers in the United States, responsible for approximately 21,000 deaths per year, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. Its effects are dose-dependent and latent. A worker exposed in 1895 might develop disease in 1910, with no medical record connecting the two events across 15 years. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities installed forced air ventilation in the most affected valley of the King's Chambers after Saber's 2010 study. The action was logged. No retrospective assessment of early 20th century clearance workers was ever conducted. No death certificates from that period would have captured the connection, even if someone had looked. Whatever those workers breathed in the dark of KV-9 across generations of colonial-era clearance operations, it was measured in 2010 and found to exceed acceptable exposure limits by a factor of 6 to 8. The tomb had been producing it since 1145 BCE. It did not care who was inside. All right, let's go. Number 9, the Royal Tombs of Sipán. In late February of 1987, Walter Alva, director of the Bruning National Archaeological Museum in Lambayeque, Peru, received a call from the local police. Looters had broken into a burial mound near the village of Sipán, in the Lambayeque Valley on the northern Peruvian coast. Artifacts were appearing on the black market in Lima. Hammered gold peanut ornaments, copper masks with inlaid stone eyes, ceramic portrait vessels of a quality that Andean archaeologists had never seen emerge from an intact context. Alva drove to the site. The mound at Sipán was a Moche burial complex dating to approximately 250 to 300 CE. The Moche were the dominant culture of northern Peru's coast for 4 centuries, and they buried their elite with an elaborateness that the archaeological record had, until that morning in 1987, largely preserved only in looted fragments reaching museum collections without provenance. Sipán was intact. The principal burial, identified as the Lord of Sipán, a warrior priest of the 3rd century CE, contained 451 individual metal objects, including a gold and silver headdress weighing 1.2 kilograms, copper sandals formed to the shape of the buried feet, a pair of gold ear spools 9.4 centimeters in diameter, and a ceremonial back flap in hammered gold that represents one of the most technically accomplished surviving examples of pre-Columbian metalwork. 3 subsidiary burials flanked the main chamber. Warriors and an attendant interred alongside the Lord in postures that indicated they had been placed there to serve him in whatever came after. The site had been sealed beneath an adobe mound for roughly 1,700 years. The violence of the discovery came first. The first looter to excavate and sell major artifacts from Sipán was shot dead by rivals within 4 months of the initial break-in. The economics of black market antiquities in Peru in the 1980s resolved disputes at gunpoint. Custodio Flores, the guard subsequently hired to protect the legitimate excavation, was killed by members of the same looting network. Alva himself received death threats of sufficient credibility that the Peruvian military provided armed escort throughout the excavation period. His family relocated. The violence was the surface layer. The chemistry was underneath. Working in the excavation tunnels below the adobe mound, confined passages averaging less than 1.5 meters in height, bored through packed earth and organic burial fill in a high-humidity coastal environment. Alva's legitimate excavation team accumulated documented incidents, workers reporting persistent headaches after extended underground shifts, nausea on re-entry after the tunnels had been sealed overnight. One entry in the excavation diary held at the Bruning Museum describes a worker losing consciousness briefly at depth and being removed from the tunnel for observation. Hydrogen sulfide accumulates in confined, oxygen-poor organic burial environments. It is produced by anaerobic bacteria metabolizing sulfur-containing compounds in decomposing organic material. The deposits at Sipán included decomposed textile wrappings, food offerings, the organic remains of the sacrificed attendants, and trace amounts of decomposing structural wood. All of it generating sulfur compounds across 17 centuries of continuous microbial activity in a sealed space. The sealed adobe mound had functioned as an incubator. The concentrations in the lower tunnels were sufficient to produce the subacute exposure symptoms logged in the excavation record: the headaches, the nausea, the brief loss of consciousness. Forced air ventilation was implemented after the third documented incident. The implementation is noted in the excavation diary. The 3 prior incidents are recorded without formal attribution to chemical cause. Sipán protected its dead with metal worth dying for and air that punished those who came for different reasons. Both mechanisms were effective. All right, let's go. Number 8. The Valley of the Golden Mummies. In early 1996, a guard at the Temple of Alexander the Great at Bahariya Oasis, 370 kilometers southwest of Cairo in the Western Desert, lost control of his donkey. The animal stepped through what appeared to be the surface of the ground. The guard looked into the hole and saw gilded faces looking back up at him. Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, was dispatched to assess the find. What lay beneath the Bahariya sand was a Roman period necropolis of unprecedented scale. The burials dated to the 1st through 4th centuries CE, the period of Roman administration of Egypt, and they displayed the hybrid aesthetic of that era. Mummy cases painted with Roman portrait faces above Egyptian-style body decoration, some bodies encased in gilded cartonnage of formal Ptolemaic pattern, others wrapped in linen with gold leaf applied directly to the face and chest. Formal excavation began in 1999. Within the first 2 field seasons, 105 mummies had been recovered from 4 burial chambers. Hawass estimated publicly that the full site, extending under an unmapped section of the oasis, might contain hundreds more, possibly over 1,000. The site has not been fully excavated. The comprehensive count does not exist. The first team to descend into the primary shaft without respiratory protection in 1999 did not complete its initial survey. 2 workers began vomiting within 12 minutes of entering the sealed chamber. A third developed acute bilateral eye irritation and had to be guided out. The 3 were removed and examined by a site physician. The team did not re-enter that day. When they returned, they wore masks. The excavation record diverges from the published accounts at exactly this point. The Bahariya burials are Roman in period, but Egyptian in practice. Natron, one of the sodium-based mineral salt used in mummification for thousands of years, was applied in quantities consistent with formal Egyptian mortuary practice. In the 16 centuries between the sealing of the burial chambers and 1999, the natron had not remained inert. Natron absorbs atmospheric moisture and decomposes over time, releasing sodium carbonate as a fine alkaline dust that irritates mucous membranes and causes chemical conjunctivitis and airway inflammation on sustained exposure. The organic wrapping materials, linen bandages, resin coatings, compressed plant fiber used as packing, had become substrate for fungal colonization. Stachybotrice chartarum and cladosporium species had established through the textile layers and the biological material beneath. Both genera produce mycotoxins. Stachybotrice produces trichothecenes, which suppress immune function and cause hemorrhagic inflammation of the lung tissue at high inhalation doses in confined environments. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority issued a mandatory respiratory protocol for all personnel entering Bahariya burial chambers following the 1999 incidents. The policy is documented in the formal operational guidelines of the Supreme Council. 4 workers who participated in the initial unprotected descent were subsequently treated for respiratory symptoms at the Bahariya Regional Health Clinic. The published excavation account, which appeared in Hawwass's work and in subsequent Egyptian antiquities publications, addresses the incident response in 2 sentences. Both sentences use the word precautionary. No one died at Bahariya. The protocols once implemented worked, but what the protocols required acknowledging, without stating plainly, was that a chamber sealed 1,600 years earlier had produced, within 12 minutes of unprotected entry, an atmosphere capable of hospitalizing healthy adults. The gold was intact. The mummies were preserved. The air was not what anyone had planned for. All right, let's go. Number 7. The Tomb of Lord Pakal. In 1949, Alberto Ruiz Luillier, a Mexican archaeologist of French-Cuban descent working for the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia, was conducting a survey of the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque when he noticed something in the floor of the uppermost chamber. A row of stone plugs, sealed with plaster, ran across the floor in a line that did not correspond to any structural purpose. The floor beneath was hollow in a way that solid temple construction should not have been. He applied for an excavation permit and began clearing. The clearance took 4 years, 4 consecutive field seasons of removing stone-filled debris from an internal staircase that had been packed with rubble when the tomb was sealed in 683 CE. Each season, the team descended further into the pyramid's core. The stone was solid Palenque limestone, wet with groundwater seep from the surrounding jungle. The staircase spiraled downward 9 meters below the temple floor. On June 13, 1952, Ruiz Luillier reached the bottom. A triangular stone door blocked the final passage. Beyond it was the burial chamber of Kinich Janab Pakal I, the most powerful ruler of the classic Maya city of Palenque, who had died in 683 CE at age 80 after a reign of 68 years. The sarcophagus lid weighed 5 metric tons. The carved relief on its surface would later become, in a misreading so widespread it became its own publishing category, evidence of an ancient astronaut in a space capsule. Epigraphers have spent decades explaining that it depicts a king descending into the jaws of the underworld. The misreading persists. That is not what killed Ruiz Luillier's workers. The flame extinguished. That is where the protocols of 1952 ran out. Before the triangular door was fully displaced, a standard flame test was performed. The practice of introducing an open flame through a gap to assess available oxygen before personnel enter a confined space. The flame went out within seconds. The implication was immediate and required no laboratory. The oxygen inside was below approximately 16%, the lower combustion threshold for a standard flame. 16% oxygen is also the point at which human cognitive function begins to degrade. Impaired judgment and coordination at 16%, progressive disorientation below 14, loss of consciousness around 10. The explanation is biological. A sealed chamber in high rainfall, tropical karst operates as a sustained chemical reactor. The limestone of the Palenque region is highly porous. Groundwater percolates through it continuously, carrying dissolved organic acids. The result is 2 converging CO2 generating mechanisms inside the burial chamber. Direct chemical reaction between percolating groundwater and calcium carbonate in the limestone, which releases carbonic acid that off-gasses as carbon dioxide, and sustained microbial respiration from bacterial colonies established in the organic material inside the chamber, food offerings, textile wrappings, the residual biological content of Pakal's burial, that had been metabolizing in the sealed space since 683 CE. 1,269 years of continuous bacterial respiration with nowhere for the output to go. The Aina War excavation notes, archived in Mexico City, record that Ruz Luilier's team worked the burial chamber in timed rotations with forced air circulation intervals between sessions to allow the atmosphere to equilibrate towards safe oxygen levels. 2 workers are noted as requiring removal from the chamber for medical observation, following entries during the initial atmospheric stabilization period. The clinical nature of the observation is not specified in the archived notes. Pakal had been in that room for 12.5 centuries. The chemistry inside the limestone had been building the entire time. Patient, structural, indifferent. Whatever protection his builders intended when they sealed the staircase with rubble and closed the triangular door, the biology of the jungle around them had constructed a second layer underneath it that no stone could produce. All right, let's go. Number 6. Mawang Dui. In January 1972, construction workers drilling for a hospital site near Changsha in Hunan Province, central China, struck resistance at depth that their equipment registered as unexpected density. Further excavation revealed a sealed burial shaft that opened into the most intact Han Dynasty tomb assemblage ever recovered. The burial of Xin Zhui, Marchioness of Dai, wife of the Marquis Li Kong, who died in approximately 163 BCE at an estimated age of 50. The preservation was without precedent in Chinese archaeology and remains at this distance without equivalent anywhere in the world. The body was found submerged in a reddish-orange liquid inside 4 nested lacquer coffins of decreasing size, each sealed within the last, enclosed in an outer wooden sarcophagus surrounded by 5 metric tons of charcoal packing, and a white clay barrier 1.3 meters thick. The charcoal had absorbed atmospheric moisture from the surrounding soil. The clay had sealed the internal environment from any further exchange. The system had maintained near constant humidity and temperature for 2,133 years. Lady Di's skin was still flexible at the time of discovery. Her joints still moved through their normal range of motion. Her eyelashes were intact. Pathologists from Hunan Medical University performed a complete clinical autopsy. They found melon seeds in her stomach, the remnants of a final meal consumed within 2 hours of her death. They documented atherosclerotic plaques in the coronary arteries consistent with advanced cardiovascular disease, gallstones, evidence of whipworm and pinworm infestation, and concluded she had died from a myocardial infarction, most likely triggered by the consumption of that last meal within an hour of eating it. The 80 liters of reddish-orange liquid surrounding the body received separate analysis by the Hunan Provincial Museum Laboratory. Primary identified components: decomposed burial fluids, degraded organic preservative compounds, and mercuric sulfide, cinnabar, applied in substantial quantities as part of Han Dynasty mortuary practice. Cinnabar is the principal commercial ore of mercury. It was used across East Asian burial traditions as a preservative and a symbol of immortality. The red color associated with life and vitality. In the presence of long-term moisture and microbial activity, mercuric sulfide converts to organic methylmercury compounds. Methylmercury crosses the blood-brain barrier. It accumulates in neural tissue. At acute exposure levels, it causes progressive neurological damage, fine motor tremor, sensory disturbance, cognitive impairment, and, in severe cases, hemorrhagic destruction of brain tissue. Workers who handled the reddish liquid during the initial excavation without chemical protective equipment reported skin irritation, persistent headaches lasting several days, and in 2 documented cases, fine motor disturbances, a subtle tremor in the hands, lasting several weeks. Both sets of symptoms are consistent with acute low-level methylmercury exposure through dermal contact and mucous membrane absorption. The Chinese Ministry of Culture ordered the laboratory examining the coffin contents to undergo formal chemical decontamination after the study was concluded. This is not a standard procedure for an archaeological analysis. The body itself, 2,133 years after death, still contained viable bacteria that could be cultured in a modern laboratory. Microbiologists who sampled the internal organs recovered organisms from the material. The cultures were destroyed as a biosafety measure. The most perfectly preserved ancient human body ever recovered was also the most biologically hazardous artifact in the excavation. Those two facts are not separate. The conditions that maintained Lady Di's tissue with clinical precision, sealed, humid, temperature stable, chemically active, also produced a 2,133-year-old biohazard in a coffin that the workers who opened it were not equipped to handle. All right, let's go. Number 5. The tomb of Amenhotep II. On March 9, 1898, Victor Loret, French archaeologist and inspector general of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, entered an unsealed tomb in the Valley of the Kings, catalogued as KV35, and found not one royal burial but 17. This is where the 1898 excavation record stops reading like archaeology and starts reading as something that did not have a name yet. The chamber had been used by Theban priests of the 21st dynasty, approximately 1000 BCE, as a royal mummy cache. Following a wave of royal tomb robberies during the late New Kingdom period, priestly officials gathered the mummies of Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, Seti II, Merimta Sifta, Tusret, Ramesses IV, Ramesses V, and Ramesses VI, plus 8 additional royal individuals, and transported them to this single chamber. They arranged them in 2 side rooms and resealed the entrance. The purpose was protection. The effect across the following 2,900 years was concentration. 17 adult human bodies in various states of preservation, spanning nearly a millennium of individual burial history in a sealed limestone chamber. Each body a source of organic decomposition product, each a substrate for fungal growth. The combined biological load in KV35 on March 9, 1898, was not comparable to what a single royal tomb would produce. It reflected the accumulated output of 17. When Loret's team entered, they used the instruments and protocols of 1898 archaeology. There were none designed for biological exposure in confined ancient spaces. That category of risk had no formal existence in Egyptian field practice. Workers lifted and examined the mummies with unprotected hands. Loret himself worked directly in the chamber during the initial examination. The work took weeks. Within 3 weeks, 4 members of Loret's primary Egyptian work crew had developed severe respiratory symptoms, persistent cough, elevated fever, difficulty breathing. Loret was admitted to hospital in Cairo with a febrile illness during the excavation period. He recovered and returned to work. 3 of his workers did not recover without significant long-term consequence. 2 died within 18 months of the 1898 season. A third died within 2 years. The death certificates recorded pneumonia, febrile illness, and cardiac complications, respectively. No connection to the excavation was formally noted by any physician involved. In 2009, microbiologist Nicola Di Girolamo published findings in Clinical Infectious Diseases documenting viable Aspergillus fumigatus, recovered from tissue samples taken from royal mummies across multiple Valley of the Kings sites. Aspergillus fumigatus produces conidia, spores, 2 to 3 micrometers in diameter. At that scale, they bypass the mucociliary defense of the upper airway and deposit directly in the alveoli, the gas exchange tissue at the deepest level of the lung. Aspergillus fumigatus causes invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. Initial presentation is persistent cough and low-grade fever that resembles an ordinary respiratory infection. In individuals with high-dose primary exposure, those who have inhaled a sufficient initial bolus of spores before the immune system has time to mount a response, the infection progresses. The fungal hyphae grow through the alveolar wall. They invade the lung vasculature. The result is hemorrhagic destruction of lung tissue, vascular occlusion, and systemic spread through the bloodstream. KV-35 was not a single-body burial. 17 bodies. 3,000 years of biological activity in a sealed space. The spore density in that chamber on March 9, 1898, was not comparable to anything Lauret had encountered before. It could not have been. The 21st dynasty priests who assembled that cache acted to protect the royal dead from looters. They were thinking about looters. They were not thinking about what 17 concentrated organic sources would produce over 3 millennia in a sealed room. They left a biological concentration event inside a stone crypt. The workers who entered it in 1898 died of causes recorded on death certificates that did not and could not explain what had actually happened. All right, let's go. Number 4. Tamerlane. On June 19, 1941, Soviet archaeologist Mikhail Mikhailovich Gerasimov descended into the crypt of the Guri Amir Mausoleum in Samarkand, Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, and opened the coffin of Timur, the 14th century Turco-Mongol conqueror whose military campaigns between 1370 and 1405 CE produced casualty estimates compiled across multiple independent historiographic surveys. That placed the total death toll of his conquest somewhere between 15 and 17 million people, representing at the time of his campaigns approximately 5% of the global human population. Gerasimov's purpose was forensic anthropology. He intended to reconstruct Timur's face and physique from the skeletal remains using the Gerasimov method of facial reconstruction, which he had spent his career developing and which would eventually be adopted by forensic identification specialists across the Soviet Union and internationally. The operation had full authorization from the Soviet Academy of Sciences and from Moscow. It was scientific in its framing, documented in its execution, and unambiguous in its intent. Before Gerasimov descended into the crypt, 3 local elders arrived at the mausoleum courtyard and requested an audience with the expedition's lead official. They brought a manuscript, identified by the mosque's custodians as the Oybek Book, a document recording inscriptions and historical warnings associated with the tomb. They were permitted to speak. The message they delivered? An inscription on the inner coffin stated that whoever disturbed Timur's remains would unleash a conqueror more terrible than Timur himself. A secondary inscription, verified by Gerasimov's team after entry into the crypt, was more specific. Whosoever opens my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I. The expedition officials acknowledged the warning and continued. The coffin was opened on the night of June 19th to 20th, 1941. The excavation record is archived at the Institute of Archaeology in Tashkent. The dates are documented with specificity unusual even for Soviet archaeological records, as though the expedition's leaders understood, at some level, that the sequence of dates would matter. On June 22nd, 1941, 72 hours after the opening, the mightiest Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. In the early morning hours of that Sunday, 3.8 million Axis troops crossed the Soviet border simultaneously along a front 2,900 kilometers long, from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The invasion was the largest single military operation in recorded human history. The Soviet Union, absorbing the initial assault with catastrophic losses, would ultimately lose an estimated 26 to 27 million people before Germany's defeat in May 1945. Gerasimov completed his reconstruction and returned to Moscow. He survived the war without documented incident, continued his research, published extensively, and died in 1970 at age 64. The inscriptions did not target him. The statistics of a world war were not his responsibility. The coincidence, and it is by every available causal framework a coincidence, is geometric. A warning inscribed in stone in 1405. An opening dated to the hour. An invasion dated to the same 72-hour window. The human brain, selected over millennia for pattern recognition, in environments where patterns corresponded to real causal relationships, struggles to file this in the coincidence drawer and close it. The difficulty is a feature of our cognition, not a claim about the metaphysics of 14th century Islamic burial inscriptions. What is harder to explain through a coincidence is what Joseph Stalin did next. Documents declassified from the Soviet state archives after 1991 established that Stalin, in November 1942, ordered Timur's remains returned to Samarkand and the Gur-e-Amir tomb resealed with a religious ceremony. The order was carried out. 4 months later, the Soviet army completed the encirclement at Stalingrad and began the counteroffensive that turned the Eastern Front. Stalin authorized the opening in June 1941. Stalin reversed the decision in November 1942. No historian has proposed a satisfying account of why the leader of a scientific materialist state, in the middle of the largest existential crisis his country had ever faced, devoted resources to resealing a medieval tomb. All right, let's go. Number 3, the Mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang. In approximately 90 BCE, the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, working from court records and oral transmission, roughly a century after the first emperor's death, wrote a description of the burial complex at Lishan, Shanxi province that reads as either historical mythology or technical documentation, depending on which century you are reading it from. He described rivers of liquid mercury engineered to flow through the burial chamber in the patterns of the Yellow River and the Yangtze, driven by mechanical systems designed to maintain continuous movement. He described a ceiling inlaid with pearls arranged to map the constellations. He described mechanically triggered crossbows at the entrance passages, designed to fire on any intruder who penetrated to the inner chambers. He described the bronze mountains and seas of a scaled model of the empire. He described the sealed-in bodies of the craftsmen who built it, and the court concubines who served the emperor. Everyone whose knowledge of the construction needed to die with them. For most of the 20th century, the standard scholarly position was that Sima Qian's account should be read as literary elaboration, the cosmological amplification that surrounded powerful rulers in every ancient tradition. The Mercury rivers, specifically, were treated as symbolic, a representation of the imperial domain over water, not a literal description of the burial's contents. In 2002, a research team from the University of Northwest China collected soil samples from the surface of the burial mound at Lishan. The published results documented mercury concentrations in the mound's topsoil approximately 100 times higher than the geological background level of the surrounding Shanxi Plain. The elevated readings were not distributed uniformly across the site. They mapped to a specific footprint that corresponded to the estimated position of the buried chamber. The pattern was not a geological deposit. It was a contained, localized source leaking upward through 2,200 years of overburden. Sima Qian's account was not elaboration. In 2016, Duan Xingbo's team at the Chinese Academy of Sciences completed a comprehensive ground-penetrating radar survey of the unmapped sections of the Lishan complex. The buried chamber's approximate dimensions, derived from the radar returns, allowed calculation of the volume of enclosed space. The volume of mercury required to fill a portion of that space, consistent with the river system description in Sima Qian, runs to several thousand kilograms. Liquid mercury at ambient temperature produces vapor pressure of approximately 0.0013 atmospheres. In a sealed space, that vapor accumulates rather than dispersing. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration's immediately dangerous to life or health threshold for mercury vapor exposure is 0.056 milligrams per cubic meter. The estimated concentration inside the Lishan burial chamber after 2,200 years of sealed evaporation exceeds that threshold by multiple orders of magnitude. Entry without sealed positive pressure respiratory protection would produce acute mercury poisoning within minutes of exposure. The Chinese government has not opened the main burial chamber. The official explanation cites irreversible oxidative degradation of the artifacts upon atmospheric exposure. This is accurate. The lacquers and organic materials inside would begin deteriorating immediately upon contact with oxygen. It's also accurate that the chamber presents a documented mercury vapor hazard that cannot be safely managed without specialized equipment that is not standard to archaeological excavation practice. Both explanations are true and both apply. Only one appears in official communications about the site. Qin Shi Huang himself died in 210 BCE at age 49, following months of progressive cognitive and behavioral deterioration, documented in the court records that Sima Qian compiled. Paranoia, erratic decisions, violent mood fluctuation, eventually complete withdrawal from governance. The court physicians had been prescribing cinnabar-based elixirs as immortality preparations. He consumed mercury in the belief that it would make him deathless, while his engineers finished construction of a burial chamber below Lishan, designed to kill anyone who entered through mercury vapor at lethal concentration. He built the same death in two different places, one inside him moving slowly on the organic timeline of chronic poisoning, one beneath the mountain, sealed and waiting for anyone who came after him. The mountain is still sealed. The mercury is still liquid. It has been producing vapor in the dark for 2,200 years. Sima Qian records that 700,000 conscripted laborers were involved in the construction of the Lishan complex, beginning when Qin Shi Huang ascended the Qin throne at age 13 and continuing for 37 years. The workers who finished the innermost chambers, the men who positioned the crossbow mechanisms and sealed the mercury delivery systems in their final configuration, were, according to Sima Qian's account, sealed inside with the contents to prevent the technical knowledge from leaving with them. Archaeological work in the outer perimeter zones of the complex has recovered skeletal assemblages in areas where the exit passages appear to have been closed from the construction site in the final phase, consistent with Sima Qian's account. The craftsmen who built the trap became the first people inside it. Whatever they understood about what they had built, They took that understanding into the dark beneath Lycian along with everyone else the emperor decided had seen too much. All right, let's go. Number 2. The Tomb of Casimir IV. On April 18th, 1973, a team of 15 Polish scholars, archaeologists, conservationists, and members of the clergy entered the Jagiellonian Chapel of Wawel Royal Cathedral in Krakow, Poland, and opened the sarcophagus of Casimir IV Jagiellon, Grand Duke of Lithuania, King of Poland, and Patriarch of the Jagiellonian dynasty, who had died in June of 1492, the month Columbus departed from Palos de la Frontera on a voyage that would be confirmed as the Americas the following year. The coffin had not been opened in 481 years. The procedure was standard archival practice for historically significant royal burials. Identification of remains, assessment of preservation condition, documentation of burial objects. The team consisted of experienced professionals working in an established cathedral environment with documented access protocols. The chapel was not sealed. It was accessible for religious use. No protective respiratory equipment was worn by any member of the team that morning. There was no established reason in European archaeological practice in 1973 to expect that one would be needed. Within 3 weeks of April 18th, 7 members of the team had developed severe respiratory symptoms: persistent cough, elevated fever, in several cases chest imaging showing bilateral pulmonary infiltrates, shadows in the lung tissue indicating inflammation or fluid accumulation. By the end of 1973, 12 of the 15 people who entered the chapel that morning were dead. They died of causes recorded separately on individual death certificates: heart attacks, acute respiratory infections, stroke, one case of cardiac arrest following a febrile episode. No connection between the deaths and the opening of the sarcophagus was formally acknowledged by any physician, institution, or government body. A decade later, forensic microbiologist Bolesław Smyk at the Jagiellonian University began examining the mortality cluster. Smyk collected samples from the Wawel tomb environment and identified Aspergillus flavus as the primary organism present in quantities far above any incidental contamination that the cathedral itself might account for. His findings were published in 1994 in the journal Mycopathologia. The numbers in that paper are specific. Colony-forming unit counts from the tomb samples ran to 1.8 times 10 to the 4th power CFU per cubic meter of air volume in the chapel space at the time of sampling. The threshold at which occupational health authorities require respiratory protection in modern buildings is 500 CFU per cubic meter. The team that opened the Casimir sarcophagus on the morning of April 18th, 1973, was exposed to fungal concentrations 36 times the mandatory protection threshold, in an enclosed stone chapel with no forced ventilation and no respiratory protection for the duration of the opening procedure. Aspergillus flavus produces aflatoxin B1. Aflatoxin B1 is the most potent, naturally occurring carcinogen identified by modern biochemistry. More carcinogenic than most synthetic chemicals, classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer in Group 1. Definitively carcinogenic to humans. It also produces direct cytotoxic secondary metabolites that at high-dose acute inhalation concentrations cause chemical pneumonitis. Rapid inflammatory infiltration of the alveolar tissue, followed by fibrinous exudate and, in severe cases, hemorrhagic consolidation. The lung filling with its own inflammatory response until gas exchange becomes impossible. The timeline is not slow. The initial inflammatory response to high-dose Aspergillus flavus exposure begins within hours. The clinical presentation over the following days resembles a severe pneumonia. The distinction from bacterial pneumonia is not reliably made without specialized fungal cultures, which were not ordered for any of the Wavell team members in 1973, because no physician connected their deaths to a shared exposure event. 3 of the 15 survived without serious illness. Smike's 1994 paper notes this and does not explain it. The 3 may have been positioned away from the sarcophagus at the moment of maximum spore dispersal. The seconds immediately following the displacement of the lid, when the accumulated pressure differential between the sealed interior and the chapel atmosphere forces the enclosed air outward in a bolus. Proximity at that moment determines initial exposure, or the survivors reflect individual genetic variation in innate immune response to Aspergillus antigens. A polymorphism in the gene encoding dectin-1, a fungal pattern recognition receptor, is known to affect susceptibility to invasive aspergillosis. Smike acknowledges both hypotheses without resolution. 12 people entered the Jagellonian Chapel healthy on a Tuesday morning in April 1973 and were dead before December. They did not know what was in the box. The organism that killed them had been growing there since 1492. Accumulating in a sealed stone environment, generation after generation of fungal colony, building to a concentration that no one had thought to measure because no one had thought to look. This is not a curse, it is a colony. Aspergillus flavus has been building in sealed medieval European crypts since the Sipán crypts were sealed. Casimir IV was not the first king whose burial contained it. He is the case where a microbiologist counted the bodies afterward, measured the organism, and published a number. All right, let's go. Number 1, Tutankhamun. At approximately 9 in the morning on November 4th, 1922, a 12-year-old Egyptian water boy working for Howard Carter's expedition drove a digging stick into the ground in the Valley of the Kings and struck stone. The stone was the first step of a staircase cut into the Theban bedrock in approximately 1323 BCE. By evening, Carter's team had uncovered 12 steps. Carter refilled the staircase with excavation debris and sent a telegram from Luxor to Lord Carnarvon's estate in Hampshire, England. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Carnarvon arrived in Egypt on November the 23rd. The staircase was reopened. On November the 26th, 1922, Carter used a small metal rod to make a breach in the upper left corner of a plastered door at the bottom of the shaft and inserted a lit candle. Heat from the tomb's interior caused air to rush outward past the flame. Evidence of sealed space, not collapsed rubble. Carter widened the hole enough to insert his head. Lord Carnarvon, standing directly behind him in the corridor, asked what he could see. The answer has been reproduced in every account of the discovery in every language for a century. Wonderful things. The room contained 5,398 individual objects organized across 4 chambers. The most intact royal burial assemblage ever recovered from the Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun had died at approximately 19 years of age. His tomb was the smallest royal burial in the valley, measuring 110 square meters across all chambers, and it had survived undisturbed because the debris from a later tomb construction, Ramesses VI, catalogued as KYV9, had buried the entrance and erased it from the memory of any living person before systematic looting of the valley could reach it. The objects inside had not been touched since 1323 BCE. 3,267 years. In the language of microbiology, 3,267 years represents somewhere between 3 and 12 million bacterial generations, depending on the organism and the doubling time assumed. For Aspergillus canidia in a sealed, dry Egyptian limestone environment, the relevant number is not generations. Aspergillus does not divide. It grows and sporulates, but decades of slow mycelial expansion through an organic substrate that never dries completely because the limestone breathes moisture continuously from the water table below. What this produces over 3,000 years in a confined, sealed space is not a dead museum specimen. It is a living colony at peak density, with nowhere to grow outward and no environmental disturbance to reset the accumulation. The first breath of outside air through the breach Carter made on November 26th moved spores that had been building toward that moment since 1323 BCE. Lord Carnarvon died on April 5, 1923, 130 days after the outer seal was broken. He was 57. The recorded cause of death was blood poisoning following erysipelas, a streptococcal skin infection that had developed from a shaving nick on his cheek. Carnarvon had arrived in Egypt with a documented medical vulnerability. A serious automobile accident in 1901 had left him with chronic respiratory damage and cardiovascular compromise significant enough that his physicians had recommended he winter in Egypt rather than in England for years before the K-62 discovery. He was not a healthy man entering a sealed tomb. He was a compromised man entering an environment that had been sealed for 3 millennia. The newspapers in London and Cairo were not interested in the clinical picture. The Mummy's Curse appeared in the Daily Express on April 6, 1923. The phrase required no evidence and spread faster than any microorganism. The mythology arrived first. The science was slower. Both eventually arrived at the same problem. In 1985, Ezzedine Taha, a microbiologist at Cairo University, published laboratory results from cultures taken across Egyptian mummy samples from multiple sites in the Valley of the Kings. He identified Aspergillus niger in concentrations consistent with high-density established colonies, organisms that had been in continuous culture in the organic substrate of mummy wrappings and burial goods for centuries or millennia. Aspergillus niger causes black aspergillosis. At high inhalation doses, particularly in individuals with pre-existing respiratory compromise, the exact profile Lord Carnarvon carried, it causes progressive hemorrhagic pulmonary infection. The path from inhalation to septicemic blood poisoning runs through the lungs, and streptococcal infection can co-infect with aspergillus in immunocompromised tissue. Taha died in a Cairo automobile accident within the same year his paper was published. This coincidence was absorbed immediately into the mythology. His laboratory findings were not. In 2002, Gotthard Kramer of the University of Leipzig conducted a systematic analysis of samples from 40 Egyptian tombs, including multiple royal burials in the Valley of the Kings. 40 distinct mold species were identified across the sample set. The critical finding, tombs that had remained sealed since antiquity showed consistently higher organism density than tombs previously entered and ventilated. Sealing preserved the biological load. The longer the seal, the higher the concentration upon first entry. KV62 sealed for 3,267 years and entered by Carter's team on November 26, 1922, would have contained the highest organism density of any opening in modern Egyptian archaeology. In 1999, Nicola di Girolamo examined samples from Carter's own collection. Objects and wrapping material preserved since 1922 at the Griffith Institute at Oxford University. Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus niger were both present and viable. Not dead. Not dormant. Alive, 77 years after collection, capable of producing active infection if transferred to a susceptible host. The organisms had left the tomb with the artifacts and remained viable in a university archive for 8 decades. The statistical analysis of the cursed deaths has been conducted and repeated. The cohort of 26 individuals most directly associated with the opening of KV-62 in November 1922 does not show statistically anomalous mortality when compared to actuarial tables for their demographic. Largely British, largely older, largely upper-class men and women in the 1920s. The deaths across the following decade fall within the expected range. This is the conclusion most frequently cited to close the question. The problem is Howard Carter. Carter went in first. He went in last. He spent the decade between 1922 and 1932 working inside KV-62 my 10 field seasons, cataloging all 5,398 objects one by one, handling them directly with ungloved hands, photographing and measuring them in the confined burial chambers. His cumulative exposure to the organisms in that tomb exceeded every other individual's exposure by an order of magnitude that is not close. He inhaled the air of the KV-62 burial chamber more times than the total number of hours any other person spent in the tomb across its entire modern history. Carter died in March 1939 at age 64 of Hodgkin's lymphoma. Hodgkin's lymphoma has no established etiological connection to Aspergillus exposure. He outlived Lord Carnarvon by 16 years. He outlived Arthur Mace, who assisted in the opening and died in 1928. He outlived George J. Gould, who visited the tomb in 1923 and died of pleuropneumonia that same year. He outlived the statistical expectation for the cohort analysis that concluded the tomb was safe. The man who went in first stayed longest and touched everything. Came out alive at 64 of something unrelated. The man who stood behind him and asked, "What do you see?" was dead in 5 months. The Aspergillus was real and documented. The spore load in KV-62 was among the highest ever measured in an Egyptian royal burial, and it was measured in the artifacts that left the tomb and remained alive for 77 years in an Oxford archive. The biological hazard of the opening was not a myth. It was a chemistry that anyone who has read the 1985 paper and the 2002 study and the 1999 findings can verify from published sources. What none of those papers explains is Carter. Something in that chamber had been accumulating since 1323 BCE, and when Howard Carter opened the door in 1922, it let the archaeologists walk out and kept something from everyone else. We do not have a framework for what that means. We have the data. We have 3 independent mycological studies confirming the biological hazard was real. We have a statistical analysis that says the cohort mortality was normal. We have Howard Carter dying at 64 of something else entirely. The data does not resolve. 10 tombs, 10 documented incidents, radon in carved limestone, hydrogen sulfide in coastal Andean burial tunnels, Aspergillus colonies in medieval stone chapels and ancient Egyptian royal chambers, methyl mercury in Han Dynasty coffin fluid, carbon dioxide in a sealed Maya pyramid, liquid mercury vapor in a mountain in Shanxi. Every mechanism is real. Each has a measured exposure threshold, a documented pathway from inhalation to systemic failure, and a toxicological profile that can be traced on paper without appealing to anything outside chemistry. And yet, Casimir IV's tomb killed 12 of 15 people and spared 3 in a pattern that the scientist who published the fungal count in a peer-reviewed paper in a reputable journal acknowledged he could not explain. Tamerlane's warning inscription was specific. The timeline between the opening and the invasion was 72 hours, and the leader of the country that ordered the opening reversed his decision in the middle of the largest war his nation had ever survived. Qin Shi Huang died of mercury poisoning while overseeing construction of a burial chamber designed to kill through mercury vapor at concentration. He built his own death in 2 places simultaneously, on 2 timelines, and sealed them both. Tutankhamun let the archaeologists through and took the bystanders. The science explains the mechanism. The chemistry is sufficient for the deaths, but the science does not explain why the builders of these chambers knew to use mechanisms that European and American toxicologists formally described 2 millennia later. The priests of Eleusis knew how to separate the viable psychoactive fraction of ergot from the gangrenous fraction that killed people, and they maintained that distinction for 2,000 years. The Qin engineers loaded a room with liquid mercury without knowing what vapor pressure was, and the room they built remains chemically lethal 22 centuries later. The Wawel Cathedral stone held an Aspergillus colony alive for 481 years at concentrations 36 times the occupational safety threshold. Whatever knowledge produced these traps predates any record of it. The tombs did not need the modern understanding of mycotoxins, organomercury compounds, radioactive decay series, or bacterial culture methods. They only needed to be sealed. And the traps, every one of them, still function. The question modern archaeology has not formally posed is whether any of this was accidental. The assumption embedded in the field is that it was, that the biological hazards in these chambers were unintended byproducts of burial practices designed for other purposes. The Egyptians wrapped bodies in organic linen and resin because those materials were available and culturally appropriate, not because they understood that Aspergillus would colonize the substrate across 3,000 years of sealed darkness. The Qin engineers flooded the burial chamber with liquid mercury because mercury was associated with immortality and preservation in Chinese cosmological tradition, not because they had calculated vapor pressure curves for a sealed room over 2 millennia. The Moche of Sipán buried their lord with food offerings and textile wrappings because that was how their tradition honored the dead, not because they intended to generate a hydrogen sulfide environment in the burial tunnels. These are the assumptions we need to make for the history to hold together as we have written it. They may be correct. The builders of Casimir IV's Gothic chapel in Krakow almost certainly did not know what Aspergillus flavus was. The priests who gathered 17 royal mummies into Cave 35 in 1000 BCE were thinking about protecting the dead from looters, not about fungal load in a sealed space. These are reasonable conclusions. But the tombs with warnings above the sealed doors? Those are different. The builders of the Gur-e-Amir did not leave inscriptions about symbolism. They left inscriptions about what would happen if someone opened the coffin. Specific directional claims about consequence, carved in stone over the entrance to a crypt. Those inscriptions were written before the chemistry was understood. They were written before the biology was named, and the consequences they described arrived on schedule. Whatever the builders of these tombs knew, it was not what we know. The gap between their knowledge and ours may run in the direction we assume, that we know more. It may not. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.